So the collaboration between ourselves and the Scottish Agricultural College, we both had interest in these research topics, which led us to joint interest in the Oscar register and how we might use it. What we were interested in is understanding the supply and the demand of voluntary activity, which obviously Alistair's talked about to some degree, and that's where his project stemmed from also. And SEC were interested in the nature of extent, sort of a wider look at the third sector, specifically in urban and rural areas. So in terms of what we were interested in around supply and demand and voluntary activity, we were interested in whether there was a mismatch between the needs and wants of people who are looking to volunteer or who might be willing to volunteer, and the needs and the wants of the volunteer involving organisations and the groups, which is the demand. And if there is a misalignment, what issues are those around? And how effective are current strategies to help bring together people and organisations? So in terms of exploring this in a bit more depth, on the demand side, the sort of in terms of what opportunities are out there for formal volunteering, the Scottish Agricultural College were mapping the charities, so taking the charities from the Oscar register and looking at the geographic variation and distribution across Scotland. And I'll talk a little bit about that today, and that analysis was carried out by Michael Keller, who's not able to be with us. And I will go through the sort of key results from that mapping activity. And then from the same group of charities, we conducted a survey just before Christmas, and we've got some of the initial results coming back from that with Scottish Charities, which looked more in depth in terms of their challenges in engaging volunteers. And again, we're able to look at the differences in that between rural and urban areas. We've also, I'm not going to talk about these today, but apart from the last one, they're obviously the secondary analysis, but we also conducted an omnibus survey of the general public. It was about a sample of about 1,000, and about to conduct a survey with our users. So this was really to try and engage more with the individual side of things and understand how willing they were to volunteer, what their perceptions were of how to get involved, looking more at the supply side. So starting off with the mapping work, the charities in Scotland, the key questions this work was addressing was: how does the number of charities per head vary across Scotland? How does their purpose vary across Scotland? And how far does the scale at which charities operate vary across Scotland? And the potential influence of factors such as deprivation and rurality on those variances. And to do this, we looked at the Oscar Register of Charities, which, just to sort of briefly discuss the methods, after excluding those with incompatible data that we couldn't match and locations overseas, this was 21,551 charities. And we were particularly interested in their location, their purpose, type of activity that they were carrying out, in the geographical spread of operation. And by geographical spread of operation, I think there's 5 different areas that they can choose. So it's a sort of central point, immediate neighbourhood, up to, beyond the UK in terms of geographic spread of operation. So we were particularly interested in local charities, and we'll come to that in a second. And then matched in additional data, the 6-fold urban-rural classification, so that we were able to map the spread of charities across urban and rural areas, and the data zone level data, which Alistair's also talked about today, around index of multiple deprivation. So the results from this work are that more rural areas tend to have more charities per head of population. So this isn't sort of the absolute count of charities, it's how many charities exist per 1,000 of the population. I've got a wee map there. In your packs, I actually printed these maps a bit bigger in case you're struggling to see them, or in the slides. Just pinned to the back of the slides there if they're hard to see. So you can see here that there's quite a difference between rural and urban areas in terms of the numbers of charities per 1,000 of population. with greater numbers being sort of Western Isles and the Shetlands rather than the urban populations. And then we looked at the charities specifically that carry out activities, because the Oscar register includes all charities that might be grant giving and carrying out activities, but we were really interested in ones that were actually offering, you know, services in their local area. So we filtered for just those charities and those that were operating up to one local authority area. And again, we can see that per 1,000 of the population, this is still higher in the rural areas. It's easier to see on the map, I think, rather than have a. So you can hear it again, similar to the look of the last map, urban areas of fewer charities carrying out activities in the local areas. Urban areas tend to have a higher number per head of charities with the purpose of relief of poverty. The database, the Oscar database, has a list of activities that charities may carry out that are linked to their charitable purpose, so it allows them to be registered officially as a charity. And one of these categories is relief of poverty. And although we haven't gone into that hugely in depth in terms of purpose, it's because of the limitations of the database, relief of poverty did seem to have a pattern in terms of urban-rural. And there's some evidence that the higher the deprivation, the area, the less charities there are per head of population. The majority of the charities that we looked at in the database do provide services and work locally, by which we mean work at a geographical spread of one local authority level or below. But generally, the proportion of charities that report this increases with the degree of rurality in general. So the other reason that we're interested in charities that provide services are that we're assuming that most of those charities, and this did bear out when we did some survey work, involve volunteers and rely on volunteers. And again, this is summarising the last point, that in terms of remote rural, there's greater numbers with that smaller geographical spread of operation per 1,000 population than there is for large urban areas. Sorry. So I'll now move on. You can see that I guess if we're thinking about what opportunities are there for people in rural areas compared to those in urban, then potentially there are more charities offering opportunities in rural areas than that there are in urban areas. And we conducted a survey with those charities that are working at a local level and to ask them if they were involving volunteers and the types of challenges that they were experiencing. It was a representative sample of 1,000 based on income and location, and we received a 60% response rate. And we're just starting to digest some of those initial findings at the moment, so what I'm about to present to you is really kind of hot off the press, and it'll be interesting to see your sort of interpretation. But so far it looks like they are reflecting some of what we found in the mapping work. And pick up on some of the issues that have been discussed today. We asked, in terms of primary area of work, we weren't using the same categories in the register. We were pulling that from the Scottish Household Survey, so the categories used there. So charities in remote and accessible rural areas were more likely to state that their primary area of work is local community or neighbourhood group than urban-based charities, which we thought was quite interesting, and also reflects that they're more likely to say that local community is their primary beneficiary group, compared with only 23% in large urban areas. So the focus of the charities in rural areas is potentially different to that of large urban areas, which, although we need to do a bit further analysis, looks as though they focus more on particular demographic groups such as young people, rather than their immediate local community as a whole. Urban charities were more likely to have paid staff. Around 55% were reporting, in urban areas, were reporting that they had paid staff. Conversely, 63.9% of rural charities were reporting that they had no paid staff, so there's higher levels of volunteer-led and run charities in the rural areas. Like accessible and remote rural charities face greater challenges than urban counterparts in recruiting board members. We still need to look at that a bit more depth, but it looks as though they're less likely to say that, that's not a challenge. And although this is sort of an interesting one, the majority of charities reported no change in the volunteer numbers in the last 12 months. Urban charities were more likely to have experienced a decline in volunteer numbers. All charities, whether rural or urban, identified keeping suitable volunteers involved with us, finding suitable volunteers, and being able to or having time to support volunteers as the greatest challenges they would face in the next 12 months. So in terms of differences between volunteer-involving charities in rural and urban areas, there's a difference in the number of charities operating and carrying out activities and involving volunteers in rural and urban areas. There's a difference in focus in that rural areas, the charities in rural areas seem to be serving and focusing on their local community rather than a specific demographic group. And type of charity in that there seems to be more volunteer-led charities in rural areas rather than in urban areas. However, they do share challenges around volunteer recruitment, which meets the needs of charities, which suggests that across the board there is a misalignment between what potential volunteers want and need from their volunteering experience and the needs and requirements of the charities for the services that they're providing. And they also share challenges around the ability to support volunteers who are already engaged with them.